So welcome everybody to our last grant writing Zoom training. And yeah, and today we're going to be focusing on evaluation plans and what it is that AmeriCorps headquarters and Volunteer New Hampshire are looking for those of you that have to do evaluation plans. Oh, come on, there we go. So, like I say, this is the last one in our series, and I know I still owe a few of you some feedback, so I have not forgotten. I will get that to you as soon as possible, because I know time is of the essence. So what I want to make sure we go over today are what are the basics in terms of evaluation requirements. So some of you may be looking at, you've got to do an evaluation plan now. Some of you may not have to yet do it, but I think it's good to have in the back of your mind what's going to be expected, so you can kind of keep your eye on things during the program year, because it may trigger some ideas about what could be evaluation questions you might want to study in the future. And then, so I want to talk about the requirements, what questions could look like depending on the kind of evaluation you think you want to do, and then what are the required components in a plan. So that's basically what I want to cover. But before we launch in, just to make sure I'm really clear and you're all really clear, either Emily or I saw Andrea get on as well. What is the current Volunteer New Hampshire policy on who has to do evaluation plans? Like when does that kick in? So for anybody going up for competitive funding, it's usually when you're in a recompete situation for competitive, that's when you have to do your first plan. In your first 3-year cycle of competitive dollars, CNCS, now called AmeriCorps, does not require that. And so a lot of states kind of mirror what AmeriCorps headquarters wants, but just to make sure I'm clear so I don't misspeak, somebody from Volunteer New Hampshire, can you tell us sort of?
Yeah, so we just follow what CNCS requires. We don't have any additional requirements other than that.
Okay, so any program that has had 3 years of funding that's going into a recompete situation needs to do an evaluation plan? Yes. And how many programs right now do you know off the top of your head, or maybe I can just ask all of you, who of you know you need to be doing an evaluation plan like this round, like now? I see one hand. Okay. Well, it's another big chunk of the application that you have to think about. So with this session, you'll get some ideas about how to do that. You got a few documents that Emily sent out this morning for you, along with the slides. But I've also, and I'll just mention it now, but I'll mention it again later, I've uploaded a bunch of resources that have been helpful. Some of them come directly out of trainings I've done for other states. Some of them are just, there's a few handbooks up there that I think are just really helpful in general. They're not AmeriCorps specific, but I think they do a good job of helping, especially for anybody that's newer to evaluation. Like sometimes I go and look up stuff in them, especially if trying to figure out what sample size do I need for an evaluation, all of that. The Bruner Foundation one is really, really good for that. Has some tables and they give explanations. So those are all in a Google Drive and you have the link to it. and you should be able to get in and access those. All right, so let's talk about the requirements. So generally how it works is what AmeriCorps has written in the Serve America Act, or what's kind of the minimum requirements. So after the first 3 years, well, we'll talk more about timing in a second, but if you're a program that gets under $500,000 a year in federal funds, then after your first 3-year cycle, you have to start gearing up to do a process evaluation, which means looking at some chunk of your program, not the whole thing, but some chunk of your program with the intention of figuring out, how's this working? Like, what's going well, and what might be something that we could tweak to make it even stronger in future years. So it's really looking at something about operations. An impact evaluation, if you're over 500,000 in federal funds in a year, you don't have a choice. You have to do an impact evaluation. You have to use an external person to work with you to do it. And an impact evaluation is where you're looking at most likely the performance measures, outcome performance measures for the people, or whatever. If you're an environmental program, it's something a bit different. Yeah. But basically you're comparing your outcome performance measures with a comparison group. If you're dealing with people, it's with people that didn't get the service. Because what you're trying to show is that the way your members are doing whatever they do is really effective, and it's what's moving the needle, and that things wouldn't improve without that service, which is what you're trying to show. Like, supposedly the people or things that didn't get member attention shouldn't be doing as well, hopefully, or not that we wish anybody ill, but the things that your members have been doing hopefully have added value and have really helped move the needle. So those are the two big buckets of how AmeriCorps looks at evaluations. So let's talk like the next layer down about this. So if you're going to do, if you're under 500,000 a year, or if you're over 500,000, your first 3 years, you don't have to think about evaluation. There's so much else you have to do with getting your program up and running, figuring out all the systems to support your members, partnerships, and doing a really good job with performance measurement. So in the first 3 years that any program gets funding, there's no evaluation requirement. When it starts kicking in is when you would come up on your first recompete. So then you have to put in a plan for what you would collect data on for the next 3-year cycle. You don't have to have a report yet because you haven't done an evaluation, but then it's in that second 3-year cycle that you have to start thinking about doing a full-blown evaluation. Everything from soup to nuts, planning it, collecting the data, and then getting the report ready. And then after that second 3-year cycle, every cycle after that, for as long as your program gets funded, for every recompete, you have to have an evaluation report of what you did for the 3 years prior, and you have to have a new plan. So the idea is, once you get on the evaluation train, based on how long your program's been around, you're on it, like forever. Just like every year you have to do performance measures. After a certain point, your program, once every 3-year cycle, has to do an evaluation. Mm-hmm. So it's coming, and just know that that's how it works. So for program, and I should just mention that, so if you've been funded via formula for, doesn't matter how long, and you're getting sent up to the competitive pool to see if you can get funding from that bucket of resources. The first time you compete, if you haven't been getting competitive funding, you've gotten formula funding, even if it's your second 3-year cycle, the clock gets reset on the evaluation requirement. So if you say you've been around for 6 years as a formula program, and in year 7, Volunteer New Hampshire decides to send you up to compete nationally, you're viewed by headquarters as being a year 1 program, so you don't have to do an evaluation plan. It's a little weird like that, but when things kick in, a bit depends which bucket of funding you're getting funded through. So if anybody has any questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask. And as usual, Emily will be keeping her eye on the chat for me.
Yeah, we do have one question so far. Is the funding limit, like the 500,000 threshold, is that just AmeriCorps funds or all federal funds?
AmeriCorps funds is my understanding. It's specifically related to this grant, and I'll talk a bit more about this. There may be reasons, and we're about to start it actually, why even if you don't have to, you're not forced by the amount of money you get in federal funds from AmeriCorps every year, you may start with a process evaluation, but you may challenge yourself in future cycles to do an impact evaluation, even if technically you don't have to. Because one of the reasons AmeriCorps put this whole evaluation piece in place is because it gives a different snapshot of how your program's working than your performance measures do. In some ways, your performance measures, they're really that annual snapshot of how are we doing? How many people are we serving? And are we moving the needle? So that you're kind of forced to keep your eye on that. Evaluation is a separate study that helps you go deeper on some chunk of your program to really figure out how are we doing. I think a lot of times when people hear evaluation, they think, and it's true for some other funders, not for AmeriCorps though, it's a gotcha exercise. It's kind of how grantees think about it. They're like, uh-oh, excuse me, what if our evaluation shows we didn't do as well as we've been saying we're doing? What if we find out it's not as strong? So the good news with doing AmeriCorps evaluations, you might find that out, but as long as you're able to say, okay, we learned that this thing maybe isn't working as well as we'd like it to, but here's what we're going to do about it. Here are the changes that we're going to make to our something about program operations in future years. And then you do that. It's not like getting an evaluation that doesn't have stellar glow in the dark results means you're going to lose your funding. For some other funders, that might not be true. But for AmeriCorps, that's not really the purpose of it. One big reason that AmeriCorps has programs do evaluation is it's another way to get information to help you do continuous improvement. And for those programs that do impact evaluations, it's a way to start building the evidence of effectiveness of your program. So as we've talked about, and you well know, there's this big chunk of any grant application where you have to present the evidence about what your members are doing, and at the intensity level that they're doing it, why you think that's likely to work. And sometimes it's relatively easy if you're an education program, say, to find evidence of programs that are like yours that are doing something really, really similar that you can present to say, okay, this program's doing what we're doing. They did an evaluation. This is what changed. We're doing what they're doing. So we think, we're going to be having the same kind of results. Other programs that, don't have as easy a time finding articles or studies that have been done on similar programs. So sometimes the best way to start building evidence is to study yourself. And that could be a reason to do an impact evaluation when you don't really have to. Because really, at the end of the day, there's only two ways to strengthen the evidence that you have backing up what you propose to do, have your members do. One is to do your own impact evaluation, and the other is to find evaluations of similar programs. And so, like I said, sometimes that is hard finding, and if any of you have tried to start digging around to look for evidence after the session that we did a couple times back, it's a labor intensive process, and it's sometimes hard to find things that are truly meeting what the AmeriCorps definition is of same intervention. So that could be a reason to think about doing an impact evaluation sooner rather than later, even if you're not required to. So this is just another way of talking a bit about what the flow is that AmeriCorps has set up for programs. So at the end of a first 3-year cycle, the idea is you have to do your first evaluation plan. And I think also, since state commissions have, this has been in the Serve America Act for a while, but different commissions haven't enforced it as much. So some people are just sort of coming online with their first evaluation plan. So, at some point you're going to have to do one. If it's not now, it'll be soon. And, it's another thing that your program has to do. And it does take time. It does take additional effort. And, I've worked with a lot of programs that going in, they feel like, they've got their training wheels on or just off. And they're like, well, how are we supposed to do this? We're already stretched. We're working 24/7 anyway. But you have to find a way to integrate an evaluation in on an ongoing basis to what you're doing. Because like I said a few minutes ago, once you get on the sort of the evaluation train, there's no getting off. Unless you are switching between formula and competitive funding, and then you might get a 3-year vacation, we'll call it. So the way it usually works is, and this is how AmeriCorps, then CNCS, laid it out initially, is you do your first plan, and then once you know that you've got funding for the next 3 years, then in the first year of that next 3-year cycle, that's usually when most programs are looking back at what they put in their application for their evaluation plan and revisiting it. Okay, maybe you had to make some adjustments to your model during negotiations, or maybe something's changed out there in the world. So you might need to upgrade or tweak your evaluation plan in year 1. And that's considered normal. It's not in stone. So you have to do your best shot at the evaluation plan. But as you start to really figure out, okay, this was the plan, but how are we really going to do this? Sometimes you figure out, well, maybe we didn't nail it. There's some way we need to adjust this to make it more doable. So year 1 of a 3-year cycle is usually getting ready to do data collection. So that could be tweaking the plan, maybe changing some of the evaluation questions, maybe really thinking about, are we collecting data from the right people. Are we collecting it in the right way? And then actually developing your data collection tools if you don't have them already. And sometimes it's adding a few additional questions onto something you already use. So year one is usually the get ready year. Year two is, for most programs, the data collection year. It doesn't have to be year two. It could be year one. It could be year one and year two. Some programs do that, but that's in the minority. The requirement is you have to have one full program year's worth of data. Your evaluation needs to cover one of the 3 years. So for most programs, that's year two. So you collect data in year two, and then year three, you know, is a short year. It's not really a year, because depending on when you have to turn in your next application to volunteer in New Hampshire, by the time you do your recompete, you have to have analyzed the data, written a report that talks about what you found out and what you're going to do with what you found out, and you have to have a new plan. So that third year, especially if you're going to go up competitively, you know, it's not long. It's like barely 1/4's length. So really the evaluations, they happen once every 3-year cycle. Sometimes people are confused that they have to do an evaluation every year of the 3 years, and that's not the requirement. The requirement is 1 year of data over 3 years. So it's one evaluation. It's not 3 evaluations, like, you know, performance measures are annual. An evaluation is a separate study usually that's once in a cycle. So I just want to underscore again, and I know we talked about this, so I don't want to belabor it, that over time, especially for programs that are going up competitively, the level of evidence that programs are providing that get funded, it's starting to tip towards the higher levels. So pre-preliminary, that's where you're really only having to talk about your performance measurement data and how what your members are doing relate to other programs that have been successful, but it doesn't meet the same intervention kind of criteria at the level it needs to. And so a lot of folks are here, but over time, what CNCS hopes happens is either you find, and I just was talking about this, you either find more studies of similar programs, and the good news is it's all the time that evidence exchange on the AmeriCorps website is getting more studies added in. So AmeriCorps programs are posting their reports, and if they're doing something close to what you're doing, that is all the time, it makes it more likely you might be able to find something that's relevant to you, but not for all programs. So then you may want to think about, well, how can we build an evidence through our own evaluation process? And AmeriCorps wants people to kind of have in the back of their mind, well, they might not say back of their mind, I think it's back of your mind, like a long-term research agenda. Like, yes, you do the annual performance measurement stuff, but it's like, how can you sort of know that maybe first time you have to do an evaluation, you're going to focus on studying some part of your program to see how it works, the implementation, especially if you have multiple sites. Maybe you're looking at how well does it happen using your program model in different sites, and what might not be being consistently implemented, so you can do something about that. And then over time, like if you have 2 chunks of your program, maybe one round you focus on that chunk. Maybe the next 3-year cycle you focus on a different chunk. You know, like just to know, have some general sense that over time, you're not going to be evaluating the same thing most likely every 3-year cycle, unless you take what you learned from the evaluation and you make some kind of significant changes and you want to go back and see, all right, did those changes actually help improve how we're doing? Then you might want to do the same evaluation again because the program may have changed. But generally, every 3-year cycle, you're looking at something different. It's like a new opportunity. So I just want to make sure everybody's really, really clear on the distinction between performance measurement and evaluation, because this throws a lot of people off. So performance measurement is the annual stuff you have to do, and you report to Volunteer New Hampshire. That gets rolled up to headquarters, and then that gets used a lot of different ways to keep that congressional funding coming. Evaluation is a special study. If you're doing an impact evaluation, you're probably jumping off your performance measurement outcome. But if you're a smaller program and you're doing a process evaluation, it's a separate study. It relates to your logic model, as we'll talk about in a minute, but these are not the same thing. So just please remember that. We just talked about that you may use your outcome measures and you may extend them, look at something related to them, but it's the way AmeriCorps looks at it, it's two different things. And, you know, I think one of the things that gets a little dicey here is when we talk in everyday language, we say, oh, I'm going to evaluate how we're doing. Well, when AmeriCorps is talking about evaluation, they're talking about a specific way of doing that that's different from performance measurement. So like most of us don't walk around saying, you know, I'm doing performance measurement. You may say you're measuring performance, but I think we use the term evaluation kind of loosely just in everyday conversation. And so I think that's part of what makes it confusing. So any questions on the big picture requirements of what AmeriCorps expects around evaluation? So feel free to either unmute yourself or type a question in chat, and Emily will make sure we all get to hear it.
Nothing in the chat box so far.
Okay, thanks for checking. Well, if anything pops up, make sure you put it in there or just unmute yourself and ask. So as you know, at some point in time, you have to do an evaluation plan that gets submitted in your grant application. So just a couple bars on that. There, as you know, there's a section in eGrants that's called evaluation plan, and you put a narrative in there. It doesn't give you the sub prompts for the different components that AmeriCorps is looking for when they review those. There are character limits on the evaluation plan. I think it's 10,000. I should double check that. But what goes in the evaluation plan section does not count towards your page limits, your overall page limits for the application. It's kind of viewed as a separate thing. The other thing that's true is that the evaluation plan doesn't actually come with any points in the review process, but you have to have one. So in some ways it's a check off, yes, we did it or not, but it's not like, okay, oops, we only got 2 points out of 5. There are no points associated with it. So, but they want to know that you're kind of on track, that you've done it, you've thought it through, and you could get feedback from Volunteer New Hampshire if you're a formula program on asking some questions about your evaluation plan and what you're thinking, and or maybe how you're going to measure it. If you're funded competitively, those plans do get reviewed by an outside group at the University of Chicago called NORC, and they've been hired to review all the competitive evaluation plans, especially the impact ones. And I think they're doing more of the process ones now as well. So they then go through with a fine tooth comb, and there can be a lot of back and forth to get evaluation plans into, I'm going to call it the shape that AmeriCorps expects. And sometimes that can hold up getting some things finalized in terms of the grant. So even though there's no points, like really taking this seriously and doing a good job and thinking it through as best as you can on the front end can save you some headaches later. You're likely to get feedback, and you may have to tweak some things, but of course, the less you have to tweak, as you know from other things you've gotten feedback on in your applications, just makes the process so much nicer.
Can I add something to that, Sue?
Yeah, please.
Yes. So kind of going off of what you said, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. So they not only just review your evaluation plan, but they will also provide some technical assistance to AmeriCorps state grantees at no cost to you. So if you're interested in that, you just have to reach out to us, and then we go to them, and then they will typically take them on. I know AVAP used them this past year, and it sounded like they were very helpful. So that's also an option open to all of you.
Yeah.
And then we do have a question here.
Can I just one bar about that? So the NORC folks are really strong on all things evaluation, and now they have worked with AmeriCorps enough that I think they really are doing a great job being able to tailor some of the sort of general evaluation knowledge to the AmeriCorps world, and they've worked with lots of different programs doing a lot of different things. And if you end up getting some help from them, which, it's there, so why not get it? Part of what I hope you get out of what we're going to talk about today, and maybe some of the other materials that I put up in the Google Drive, it's to help you know, like, if you need some help outside what you've planned, like that you know what questions to ask, so they can then be more helpful, and they don't start taking you down a road that maybe isn't where you wanted to go. So using outside help, whether it's them, somebody like me, somebody from a local university, a local consultant, if you have to use an external evaluator, you still need to be in the driver's seat of your evaluation. It's not something you can sort of just check over to an outside group and assume it's gonna happen the way it needs to. We're gonna go through the components in a minute after I answer whatever the question is, but especially if you're working with somebody outside that's not as familiar with AmeriCorps perspective on evaluation, sometimes they're really good at what they do, but then when they say do a report and how they talk about things, it misses it by just a tad. And then, it makes it look like the evaluation didn't really meet the requirements. So sometimes you actually have to share some of what I'm giving you with the people that are going to be helping you out. Maybe it's even somebody else in your organization that doesn't sit on these calls if you have a data person, just to make sure that they understand sort of, these are the chunks that you need to have in a plan and a report, and make sure it happens. Like, I was just working with a program in another state, and I got called in at the last minute. They were getting ready to turn in their report, and their evaluator, what he's used to doing is putting the evaluation results in a PowerPoint to present to staff and kind of give a high point of, here's what we found out and here we're going to use it. That's not enough. It has to be a report that goes through a bunch of sections. So like, they ended up with like 3 days having to do a full-blown report, and they were not happy with having to do that. But if he'd known a little bit sooner, he could have done that all along, which doesn't mean he doesn't do a PowerPoint to present to the organization kind of what the process found out. But it also needs a standalone report that goes into a lot more detail than a PowerPoint does. So, like, you all need to be informed consumers, and even if you're not the one doing the data collection and the analysis, and sometimes it is going to be you, but if it's not you, you still need to make sure you stay engaged all the way along, so you don't wake up at the end and go, whoa, this isn't what we thought we were going to get. I worked with another program that hired this big deal guy from a local university, very well respected in his field nationally. They kind of said, okay, go do this. And he studied what he was interested in most. And so when, like, the research questions hadn't really been nailed to something that was going to help the program. And then when they got this report, it was like, oh dear, you know, guess we should have like been engaged more all the way along. And it's not that he didn't do a good job. He did a good job, but just meeting some other criteria and not doing it in a way that was really helpful to the program. So I'll get off my soapbox on that, but anyway, make sure that you are at least an informed consumer and asking lots of questions. And if it's you doing it, of course, you're going to be on top of it. But if you get other people helping you, make sure that they're not just out there doing their thing. Okay, sorry, Emily.
Oh, yes. So kind of going back to your discussion about performance measurement versus evaluation, we have a question. Could you give some examples of an evaluation plan versus performance measurements for some programs?
Sure. So, and we're going to talk about this a bit more in just a couple of slides when we talk about evaluation questions, but let me just go there right this minute, and then I'll circle back because I think it helps make it clearer. So evaluation questions do relate in some way to your logic model. And if you're doing a process evaluation, the kinds of questions you ask relate to like the bottom part, the left-hand side of a logic model, and then an impact evaluation relates to the outcomes of your program. So the kinds of things that you might ask for a process evaluation, say it's a third grade reading tutoring program, and you've got multiple sites, and everybody's kind of using the same approach to how they tutor the kids. But what you've noticed is a couple of the sites seem like they're having better outcomes with the kids than a couple of other sites, and you're not sure why that is. So you might design your evaluation to really look at, are members at all sites implementing our model the way we train them to? Are they taking any shortcuts that maybe they shouldn't be? Or are they adding in some little secret sauce that they kind of intuitively figured out, or somebody suggested to them, that actually helped improve how they're doing whatever they're doing? So one thing might be to look at, okay, how is the program model being implemented? And what are best practices that members are using? And if everybody knew about those, everybody could do them. And then the whole program might have better performance measures in the future. So it's kind of the one step behind, like, okay, yeah, we said we served this many and we saw these kind of outcomes. Like, that's what you're doing maybe for performance measures. But the process evaluation would have you looking at, well, what were members really doing with people to achieve those outcomes? And is it consistent? And are there ways to improve that? So that's one kind of a thing you could look at for a process evaluation. I know I'm right now working with a couple of programs that over the past few years, they've had issues with retention of members. So what they decided to do their evaluation on is, how are we really doing our recruitment? Are the old methods still working? And how are we helping make sure that people really understand what a service experience is about, what it means to get the level of living allowance that it is, what they're going to actually be expected to do? Are they getting enough information to make an informed choice? Then how do we onboard them? Do we actually give enough training ourselves as the program? And where's the balance between what the program itself gives versus a host site? And then sometimes they're looking at what supervision look like. And are there any best practices that some sites have? Like maybe a site has said, okay, yeah, we'll supervise the member and we'll make sure that they get a sit-down meeting with their site supervisor every other week. And it's not happening. And maybe the member experience is suffering. Maybe what members are doing with whatever they're doing is suffering. So sometimes maybe you're looking at something about members and how they're being brought on, how they're being trained, how they're being used. I worked with a program in Florida that had a new program director. The program had been around for a while, but when he first came on, what he decided was, I'm not sure, like the first year he just followed the training curriculum that had been existing before. And then after doing it for a year, he's like, I think we could do something to make this stronger and help our members really hit the ground running, so that they're doing really good service out of the gate, not waiting for them like 4 months in when it all clicks in on their own. So then they actually did an in-depth study of the pre-service orientation and like the skills-based training that they gave members, and then checked in at various points during the year on, okay, well, what else do you need? And did you really, did it increase your skill in the initial training? So what else can we help you get to the next level? So there's lots of things around the process that when you do performance measures, you don't get at. It's kind of the stuff that's a bit behind the scenes that absolutely affects how many people you're going to be able to serve, or the amount of, if you're an environmental program, the amount of service your members can do. Sometimes it's like relationships with partners, and the outcomes that members are able to leverage. Like sometimes like that behind the scenes stuff, as program staff, you're probably looking at that, but especially if you've got lots of different sites, it may not be a primary focus of what you think about, but a process evaluation sort of forces you to, in a more systematic way, do something that you're probably already doing informally. And, making sure that you collect information systematically, and then you can make some better decisions about what things about your program you might want to tweak. So that's process evaluation. And then impact evaluation, pretty much always no matter what your program's doing. Environmental can be a little bit different, but especially if it's people, it's like, did the people that got served by AmeriCorps members have greater gains in whatever than people that didn't get served by AmeriCorps? So in that way, it jumps off the performance measurement outcome. So like there's a couple of examples on the screen. So like kids that got reading tutoring, do they read better at the end of third grade versus some kids that had the similar issues with reading at the beginning of the school year but didn't get member support? Where did they end up? And hopefully as a group, the folks that got tutoring from AmeriCorps, they're better off. They're reading at a higher level. And our residents, the second one is like, okay, if you get a fire safety visit, and are they more likely to actually check their smoke detector and have an evacuation plan and practice it compared to people that didn't? So you're trying to, for an impact evaluation, you're trying to make a comparison to show, okay, whatever our members did really did make the difference. And again, it does sort of go, it may jump off performance measures, but it gives you a different sort of snapshot because you're making a comparison. So I don't know if that helps answer what the question was. I see Davis saying yes. Any other questions on how evaluation might look different and the kind of questions you might ask before we move on? Because the question piece, well, let me go back for a minute and we'll circle back up to this. So I want to walk quickly through all the chunks that need to be in an evaluation plan. There's an evaluation plan components document that I've pulled together with things from NOFO and past trainings and reviewing a ton of evaluation plans that, like, if you use that, I think it's a really good guide to know what needs to go in each section. There may be some other stuff that you need to put in there, but anyway, if you cover the things on that sheet, you're going to be in good shape with your evaluation plan. So I'm going to do a kind of a high level overview of the sections here, but you can do a deeper dive with that document. And then there's another sort of companion one that talks about some of the common issues I've seen looking at hundreds of evaluation plans, so that hopefully you can avoid some of those. So one thing I just want to point out is when you do your preliminary evaluation plan, like AmeriCorps doesn't call it a preliminary evaluation plan, that's my language, but the plan you put in your recompete, like I encourage folks to think of it as it needs to be as complete as possible, but it is kind of your first crack at this is what we think we're going to do. In year one, as we've already talked about, you're going to revisit that plan and figure out, well, how are we actually going to do this thing? So sometimes you're actually find yourself revising the plan, either changing it or making it more detailed. So the stuff you put in the original plan isn't wasted. A bunch of it just pulls over to a revised plan. And then huge chunks of that move straight over into an evaluation report. In the report, there's some additional sections, like you have to give an executive summary at the beginning that kind of highlights what you did and what you found out. But then like what's your theory of change, what's the overview of the kind of evaluation you're gonna do, and then actually how you did it, what tools you used, when you collected the data, all that stuff. In some ways, if you've done a good job with your evaluation plan, the big challenge is making it all past tense, because it's already happened when you do your evaluation report. And you know, it's a tip to remember for the future. Make sure you put it in past tense, because I read reports and it's still in future tense. And it's like, no, this evaluation's already over. So you shouldn't be saying that what you will collect data on, you already did it. And then the big chunk of the final evaluation report, it doesn't really look at like it in this side by side, is that last section at the bottom where you go through and you present your results and tie them to each research question that you had. Lots of times people end up they start doing their results based on the tool that they used. It really needs to be tied to what your evaluation questions were. And then you have to talk about like what you learned and what you're going to do with what you learned. So I don't want to do too much on evaluation report, just to say, as you get clear on your plan, you're going to be working with it for quite some time. And so the more detailed you can be, it saves you time later. So part of the reason that the getting really clear on your questions is so key is, you know, if you don't really know what you're going to evaluate and what specifically you want to look at, it's really hard to set up what's the methodology and data collection tools you're going to use, and who you're going to collect data from or how you're going to collect data. So the research questions are absolutely critical. And, you know, I think a lot of programs think they need lots of questions. And, you know, 1 to 3 questions total is a good ballpark to shoot for. If you have too many, you can't possibly do a good job, high quality data collection and analysis for all of it. So sometimes there are sort of sub questions under a broader question. So that may be okay, but I think just consider that your time and your resources are limited. And AmeriCorps would rather have you do a smaller study that can go deeper, that is meaningful to your program. You're going to really learn something that's helpful. They'd rather have you do that than do this kind of broad shotgun approach to data collection to hope you find out something. So a small list of questions is what you want to go for. And to do an impact evaluation, you also a bit have to look at how the program was implemented. But one common mistake I see programs make, they say, okay, well, for our process evaluation, we're looking at this, and for our impact evaluation, we're looking at this, like they're doing 2 separate studies. You're either doing one or the other. You don't have, and it, like I said, it doesn't have to cover your entire program. Pick one thing. And if you say did K-12 math, you don't have to study all grades either. Like maybe you're just going to look at what happens in middle school, or maybe what you want to know is something about how do you really work with some subset of everybody. So again, like think something that's doable but meaningful that you think you can learn something from. Does that make sense about the questions? Yeah. And I gave a couple handouts about evaluation questions that, again, give some other examples about how to think about this. But getting clear on the questions really is absolutely critical first step. And I just want to point out a few things about terminology. I already mentioned that sometimes when you work with folks that have great technical skills in evaluation, sometimes the language AmeriCorps uses doesn't quite line up with how many evaluators talk. So AmeriCorps talks about process evaluation, impact evaluation. They do talk about outcome evaluation. I tend not to talk about outcome evaluation because really for most programs, it ends up looking like what you're doing anyway for your performance measures. So you can't, it makes no sense to do an evaluation on something you're already like just kind of repackaging what you're already doing. So I think thinking about process or impact evaluation, that's where most programs get the best bang for their buck. So a lot of evaluators talk about formative and summative evaluations. And formative evaluation, the idea there is that it happens like as a program is being implemented. So it's quite a lot like a process evaluation, and a summative evaluation is more like something that happens at the end or after something happens to see how it went. But AmeriCorps doesn't use that language. They talk process and impact. So I just want to make sure everybody's really clear on that. And part of the impact evaluation piece is they really want to know it's about causality, that your program model caused whatever change. It didn't just happen by accident. So some of the language that AmeriCorps uses, and I mean, this is pretty standard evaluation terminology, like the top dog study design to show impact is experimental design. And sometimes in AmeriCorps stuff, you see them talking about RCT. That means random control trial. And it's considered sort of the top dog study design because what it requires you to do is randomly decide who's going to get treatment or what's going to get treatment and who's not. So most AmeriCorps programs probably are never going to do an experimental design. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. For some programs, it's an ethical thing. Like if you're an opioid treatment or prevention kind of program, people don't feel good about saying, okay, these two people both have opioid related things they need help with. This one's going to get service and this one isn't. People don't feel good having to make those kind of choices, and they feel like it's an ethical dilemma that they don't want to deal with. Same with kids in school or other people who get served who doesn't. So while random control trials, experimental design is considered kind of top of the heap, if that's not going to be possible, don't worry about it. Most AmeriCorps programs are never going to be able to do it. The next best thing, and I think pretty much everybody can get at this, is quasi-experimental design, QED, and that's where you match as closely as possible people or things that didn't get service with people or things that did get service. And that's not always so easy to do. Like if it's something in a school, maybe it's a classroom where there's no members, or maybe it's a school that serves the same kind of kids that didn't have a member that you can arrange to get data from. If I'm working with a conservation program right now and like trying to figure out what's really an equivalent trail that did get treated or with sustainable practices of trail maintenance versus one that didn't, that's harder to do. So there's some different ways that environmental programs tend to look at their impact. But those are kind of the two ways that you can get at impact that AmeriCorps talks about all the time. The third bucket is non-experimental, which means you don't have a comparison group, or maybe it's a pre-post kind of a situation where you're comparing the group to itself, or you're looking at a group over time. And you can learn really good stuff from doing any of these kind of study designs. And you learn different things from each of them. So in a plan, you have to say, we're doing an impact evaluation using a quasi-experimental design. You have to make, that's a sentence that's got to be in there somewhere. Or we're doing a process evaluation using non-experimental design. So you need to say in the plan what kind of evaluation and what of these 3 basic designs you're going to do. So we've already talked about randomly assigned groups. It's hard to do. Like I say, most programs can't ever get there, and don't worry about it. Matched groups, that's not always easy, but it's way easier than if you can do a random assignment thing, that often does require some help from somebody that really understands statistics and data stuff, to help make sure that the groups really are matched. And for certain kinds of analyses where you're matching a comparison group to, again, it's often helpful to have somebody that really knows how to do that help you out. We just talked about non-experimental design, and you can see some of the ways that you might collect data there. So in an evaluation report, like I say, you have to say what kind of evaluation you're doing clearly, like a sentence, and then what's the design you picked, and why did you pick that? So, like one group that I just mentioned that did the member training was the focus of their process evaluation. Like they said in their plan, well, we're doing this because there's a new director. We want to revisit, make sure our members are getting the training they need to be able to really work effectively with students, which will then positively impact student outcomes. So just paint the picture of why you're focusing on what chunk of the program you've picked and why the design you picked is going to be helpful. And you have to have a section that talks about the strengths of what you picked and the limitations. So in the samples I sent a process sample and an impact sample, and they're samples. And one of the main reasons to share those is for you to see roughly how much stuff needs to be in each component of a plan. And, there's always a buff and shine and wordsmithing you can do to take these things to a new level. But I wanted you to have some idea of what do you need to put and what does it look like when it's done. So you can see in both of those, they've put in a couple of sentences. There's always something you can say about why what you've planned, what the strengths of that are. But for every single study you do, there's always a limitation, no matter how good it is, no matter who conducts it. And they just want to know that you're aware of it. And part of that's because you can kind of work around it if you're clear what the limitation is. Sometimes the limitation of a design is, people don't want to fill out surveys. They're surveyed to death. So you might not get complete information back. But so that's common. That's a common limitation. So that doesn't mean you'll get dinged for that. But what it gives you a hint for later is maybe you got to give some extra reminders to people. Okay, we need you to fill this out. So you have to have why you picked the design, strengths, limitations. You need to talk about what's the sample that you're going to use. So for performance measures, formula programs aren't allowed to sample. You're supposed to, you know, after you've defined like who you're going to collect outcomes on, you know, it's everybody that gets a certain amount of service. That's not sampling in the way that this is. This is, you know, you're not looking at everybody. Like if you serve 1,000 people, you're not expected to include all 1,000 in an evaluation. You may be doing a smaller chunk. So, but you have to, in your evaluation plan, talk about how you're going to do sampling. So if you're doing a process evaluation, this is an example, and it's in one of the samples the extended sample that I sent along. You know, you're often just saying it's small numbers. So we're gonna have all of our members or all of our site supervisors included in data collection. And in this example's case, they were going to include all client satisfaction surveys because it wasn't like 10,000 of them. So they said no sampling method is needed. So don't just skip it. If you think, okay, we're small, we're going to ask everybody, make sure you actually write it out, that you don't need a sampling method because you're going to collect data from everybody that you identify. Here's an example from the other sample I sent you of if you're going to do an impact evaluation, you have to talk about who's the intervention group, meaning the treatment group, the folks that members served, and the comparison group, and give as much detail here as possible. In this case, for the comparison group, what they said was, you know, we're going to pick a group as close as possible to those that get tutoring, but basically we know this is complicated, and after we get our external evaluator and we dialogue with the school district, then we'll figure out the specifics of the sample. But what somebody gets from reading this is they understand that they got to pay attention to that. So make sure you put something in about sample. You also have to think about where you're, based on what your research questions are, how are you going to collect information that helps you answer those questions? And who are you going to collect those from? So sometimes there's questions you're going to ask members. Sometimes it might be site supervisors, or sometimes it's program data that you've already collected that you're going to look at. But in this section of the evaluation plan, you need to say, we're doing a member survey. We're doing site supervisor focus groups. And then you have to talk about like what you're gonna look for, when it's gonna happen. Like with members, is it once a quarter? If it's a member survey, are you checking in with them monthly? Are they filling something out? Like, what's the timetable for when you're gonna collect data over the 1 year that you have to? And you should say kind of who's gonna do it. Are you doing it internally? Or is you may collect part of it, an external person may collect part of it, but you need to like write out your data collection related to, I think it's helpful to just do, here's the tool, and then talk about all of it together. I mean, you could just say, here's the 5 tools, but then you have to go in and later talk about each tool. I think it's just easier to do it all at once. Like, this is the tool, this is who we're collecting it from, this is what, blah, blah, blah. So here's an example. There's examples in what I sent. You also have to have a section that talks about how you're going to analyze the data. And I know this makes most people queasy. NORC and AmeriCorps headquarters did because they review the competitive evaluation plans. They reported out a couple years ago at the AmeriCorps Symposium that for the weakest section in evaluation plans was the methodology and the analysis sections. So don't just skip them, even if you're not quite sure what tools you're going to use. Like, give it your best shot. And if in the end you end up using a different tool, once you figure out how you're actually going to collect your data in year one, don't worry about it. But be thoughtful about what are the tools, and then you have to put in something about data analysis. Even if it's not much, you have to say something. And you know, there's two kinds of data you might be collecting. There's stuff that's numbers, which is the quantitative stuff, or you ask open-ended questions and you get words, basically. There's kind of boilerplate language that you can use for each of these. And you can see some of that in the samples I shared with you. So if it's qualitative data, meaning your people have like filled out like what was the most important thing about this member service, and they either told you something, they wrote it down, you're always, no matter what form it's in, you're always going to have to read through each person's statement or what they wrote and figure out what are the common themes and how many people said this versus how many people said that. So talking about content and thematic analysis, that's always what it's going to look like. Where it gets dicier is on the statistical analysis piece. For a lot of things that you might do, like on a survey, where you're saying, okay, what's the average, what was the mean answer that somebody gave? You know, that's called basic descriptive statistics. And then if you're doing something more complicated and you're comparing, you're doing an impact evaluation and you have to do comparisons, then there's a whole other set of statistical things that are more complicated, t-tests, chi-square, those kind of things. But you don't have to necessarily know how to do all of those. Like you'll see on the samples, sometimes there's just some language you can say that you're going to use the appropriate statistical tests based on the type of data that you end up collecting. So like, don't lose too much sleep about this, but if you're going to have both types of data, you have to at least reference both of them. Okay, so I'm not gonna, like, I think we've basically talked about this, but you know, you come up with your research question, and in this case, the question was, is the literacy program being implemented as designed? And then you have to think about, okay, well, if that's the question I'm answering, how would I know that that happened? Like, what would I look for? So one thing you might look for is, are members using the curriculum that either you gave them or that a school is using during, say, a tutoring session? If you've told members they need to do 20 minutes, do they do 20 minutes? Another thing you might look at is, do kids show up? Especially if it's like an after-school program, do they show up to get the tutoring? Because that could be an indicator that it's not working well. And if the kids don't show up, then they can't get the support, and then they're not gonna improve in their reading. Then you have to think about, all right, if those are the things we could look for, where can we find that information? So members are likely a good source of information for a lot of things. In this case, one idea was that an evaluator, or it could be a staff person, we're gonna actually do some observations of members doing tutoring. And if there's 3 steps they're supposed to do they do them? And have some kind of a checklist. So then, you have to think about how often does this happen, and how you're going to analyze the data. So you kind of have to think through, based on the question, the rest of it. And this is the same sort of thing, but it's with an impact evaluation. But in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going because we've got a few other sections of evaluation plan I just want you to be familiar with. So you have to put in your evaluation plan the timeline for your evaluation. And when you do that section, I suggest you look at, again, the 2 samples that I sent along. It needs to be talked about as a 3-year thing. And you need to talk about what you're going to do in year 1. And I always say, give the dates. Okay, is it 2022 to 2023? And then year 2 is 2023 to 24. And then year 3. And then pretty much what you're going to say you're doing follows the standard stuff, the way CNCS feels like the flow of an evaluation should happen. You can put some more detail in it, and some of you aren't going to be hiring an evaluator, but some of you might. So you have to kind of talk about for each year what you're doing and when you plan to do it. So if you were going to collect data for 2 years, you would talk about that. Most people are only going to say, and it's useful to say, we're collecting data for the full program year, year 2, and what dates that is. So, it may be a paragraph, but don't just skip this. Like, make sure you actually explain each of 3 years what you're going to do, because as you can see from this chart, every year it's slightly different, most likely. All right, and then there's 2 other sections you need to keep your eyes on. One is a budget. So really there's kind of 2 buckets of budgets. If you're doing a process evaluation and you're doing it yourself, or other folks within your organization are helping do it, you probably don't have a budget the way you would need to have if you are going to have to hire an external person. That requires like hard dollars, likely in a different way than if it's a process evaluation. But don't just skip it. Like you can say the evaluation is going to be conducted by staff as part of their ongoing duties. So there's no additional cost to that. And if you need something like a SurveyMonkey account to be able to do online surveys or some other thing, you could say that there will be some minimal other expenses. Maybe it's for copying if you're going to do paper forms. And then a lot of process evaluations, the program just absorbs that. But make sure you make some statement about, there's no real budget and it's going to be just integrated into the grant budget. Like there's no separate budget for the evaluation. If you're doing an impact evaluation, there are some costs, and there's up in the Google Drive, there's this tool, but there's also an Excel spreadsheet that you could go through and put stuff in and it'll add it up for you. So just a couple of bars on this. Because the timeline varies and what the tasks are for each year, don't be surprised if when you're doing an evaluation budget, especially if you're thinking about stuff you might have to buy that you don't already have, especially if it's people's time, it may look different each year depending on what's going to happen in that year. So if you're hiring an outside evaluator, like when they can be most useful is in year one, helping take your plan and really build it out and get your tools ready. Then depending on who's collecting the data, sometimes maybe you're gonna, if it's an impact evaluation, you're gonna use like standardized test scores or something. So your evaluator isn't the one collecting that data and you're not either. So in year two, maybe the budget can be a little smaller, but maybe towards the end of year two, and definitely the first part of year three, analyzing data is time consuming, and writing a report that's good is really time consuming. So, you know, sometimes I see that programs say, okay, we've got $2,000 a year. Okay, but you know, you might want to think about it one layer down, like, and are you able to roll dollars over from year to year? Because you may not need everything you budgeted in the earlier end of the cycle, but towards the back end, it may be more expensive. So anyway, this budget gives you some ideas of the things to think about that are typically included, costs in terms of evaluation budgets. And one quick comment I'll make is around overhead rates. If you're hiring an outside evaluator, make sure you get really clear on that piece, because sometimes like folks that are associated with a university and some consulting groups, you know, the overhead rate is like 50% or more, which means if you have $2,000, depending on who you hire, 1,000 of that might go to overhead, and you only really get $1,000 worth of service. So if you're negotiating with somebody outside, just make sure you're really clear like what their overhead rate is, because that can affect things. So just a few bars as we're wrapping down here on internal versus external evaluators. You know, if it's a process evaluation, it's likely you're internal. It might be you and somebody else in your organization that has maybe a data background that does support different programs run by your organization, but that's still considered internal. It's inside your organization. And sometimes people that do process evaluations have the budget that they hire somebody externally to help do it. That is completely, if you've got the money to do that and it helps you, why not? But it's not a requirement. Where it becomes a requirement is if you get over 500,000 in a year from federal funds, AmeriCorps, then you have to use an external evaluator. And that just is more expensive. There's a lot of ways to figure out what are key points during the process to use an evaluator to keep costs down. But you know, it's an expense. So you have to kind of know, especially before you start thinking about your budget, which way are you going? Because internal is going to be way cheaper to do. External, it's going to cost you something. And, you know, a lot of AmeriCorps evaluations run in the ballpark, if they use an external person, from like $10,000 over 3 years versus, you know, $40,000, $50,000. So, you know, they can be on the higher end. I don't think you have to necessarily get there. So, don't think that's what you have to do. So again, I know we're out of time, and I see somebody's coming in for a back-to-back call. Oh my. So I put some resources up in the Google Drive. I suggest the handbooks, download them and keep them somewhere. Here's some other links that might be helpful. There's lots of stuff out there to help with evaluation, but just make sure that you keep really clear on what the AmeriCorps requirements are, so that as you're putting this together, you know what you need to do. The evaluation plan components document, I've had feedback that that's really helpful if you're putting together an evaluation plan. And again, as you start working on this, if you're somebody that has to get this in sooner rather than later, please feel free to run questions by me or ask, you know, about your research questions or anything else about your plan. I'm glad to take a look at that. And I know I'm a little behind on getting feedback on some of the other things people have sent me, but hang in, I'll get there, hopefully get it all back out today. So any questions as we're wrapping down? I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you today.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat box.
Okay.
So if you're using an internal evaluator, how do you control for bias?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if it's you hopefully are walking away from this understanding that a huge reason, because you're likely also doing a process evaluation, the reason you're doing it is just to understand better how your program works. And there's no, and it's like, how do you do continuous improvement? There's no, like, they're trying to get us, take our funding away. Like, it's not that kind of a mindset. So as honest as you can be, and maybe you set up something like a data party internally where once data's collected, invite people to help you look at it and say, what do you think this means? So that's a way that you can maybe get out of your own way and hear what some other people's 2 cents worth are that may help you not be biased. There's always the potential for a little bit of bias. And if it's somebody else in your organization, of course, they want you to look good. But I think helping make sure that they understand that you need honest feedback. You need to really understand truthfully what's going on, or you can't actually make any adjustments, is an important thing to make sure you understand and whoever's working with you. Like, you don't need to kind of, okay, throw a lot of dirt in the air, because maybe then, like, you're afraid, like, uh-oh, if they see that this, like, was screwed up, we're gonna lose our funding. It isn't about that. So I think getting other people's eyeballs on the data and helping you figure out how to word questions, it's just take as much bias out as you possibly can. And yeah, I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of what I would say. And I'll post some stuff up in the Google Drive when we get off this call about data parties, which I think could be helpful. It's really just another step where you invite maybe some site supervisors, some members, maybe people in your organization, other folks. And, you know, you can make it fun, like have them look at the data and say, all right, if you found out this, what would you do about it? And what do you think it means? Like, so getting some other perspectives helps reduce bias also.
Well, thank you, Sue. I see that Davis has a question, but I think what I'm about to say might answer that for him. So just so everyone knows, you do have the opportunity to connect with Sue and like schedule some one-on-one time to work on your applications like as a whole. So I think we have next week, Sue. Like, do you want them just to reach out to you directly and see when they can fit in time, or how would you like to do that?
I will send, I've got a link for Calendly that, that's the easiest way to do it, because you know your schedule, you can go in and it'll show you what blocks that I'm open, and then you can pick one that works. So Emily, I'll send that link to you, and then you can send it out to everybody, and anybody that wants to take advantage of that.
Perfect. So I think We are not going to have so Sue will not be doing a session on the budget. Leslie, our finance and grants officer, has done sessions on it before. So if you're interested, definitely reach out to Leslie and she can definitely provide you with all the information you need, budget-wise. So I just want to say before we end, just as a reminder, continuation applications are due today by 5 p.m. in eGrants. If you have any problems with eGrants or any last minute questions, just let us know. Yeah, I think that's it. So thank you again, Sue, for all of these awesome sessions. I mean, I know I've learned some things, so it's great.
Well, I know it's a lot of stuff, and I wish each of you good luck with. There's always some way to improve your application to the next level. So I wish that for all of you, because I think strengthening the application helps you get clear in your head, and in the end strengthens what you're able to do with your program also. So best of luck, and I know I'll probably be talking with some of you. So have a good day.
Have a good day, everyone.